Does anyone know what happened on February 2nd? On Friday. What was Friday? Groundhog Day. Who's watched the movie Groundhog Day with Bill Murray? Okay. Yeah, a lot of over and over and over every day, same day. That's the premise of the movie Groundhog Day. At Truett, the seminary that I'm at, we had a professor movie night where one of the professors showed us all Groundhog Day and then made some comments on some Easter eggs, some theological Easter eggs that he thought he found in the movie. So for those of you who aren't familiar, the movie has a weatherman named Phil who is with his producer Rita and the videographer Larry, and they go to this town which he doesn't want to be. He's this narcissistic, selfish, egotistical person, and he gets stuck in this loop where every single day is the same day for him, and nobody else knows it except for him. Eventually, he falls in love with this producer who he's on set with, Rita, and he decides that he wants to pursue her every single day, even though it's the same day and she never remembers him. And it's only through his becoming a better person, moving from a narcissist to becoming a selfless person, that he finally is able to break the loop and come out a better person and move on to February 3rd. One of the Easter eggs that that the professor pointed out was that the woman's name is Rita, which is, do you know what Rita is short for? I didn't realize this, but it's short for Margarita, which in Latin means pearl. And so he says, after Phil, who's supposed to be the everyman who, we're all selfish and narcissistic until Jesus comes along. When you find that pearl of great price, you're willing to sell everything you can to go get that pearl. So I thought that was a really interesting Easter egg. Honestly, it doesn't really have anything to do with the sermon. I just wanted to tell you it. But I did want to say that because Easter eggs are not just in movies, they're also in Scripture. And I told you on week 1 when we were doing the introduction to the book of Job, that the land of Uz, the word Uz means counsel. Most of us stop reading Job after Job 2 because that's when we start getting into this poetry that's really difficult for us to decipher. And here's where we're moving into the land of counsel, right? Job is getting counsel. First he got counsel from his wife in chapter 2. Now he's getting counsel from his friends, and we'll see that all the way through chapter 40. So the plan for us is that we're going to be picking sections of Job that will highlight the most important themes that are in the book of Job. Next week, we're going to be reading Job 9 through 11, so we'll skip chapters 6 through 8. If you would like to read those on your own, you are more than welcome to do so. Of course, that means you're going to have to add a couple extra chapters into your reading, but Job 9 through 11 is going to be the assignment for next week. And I'll say one more thing about the assignment. If you haven't yet joined us as we're reading together these chapters in Job, I would encourage you, it's not too late to start, right? Even if you didn't read Job 1 with us, Job 2 with us, we're still going along. So as we're progressing through, I would encourage you, set your reminder on Friday, read Job along with us. It will help you get a lot out of these sermons too, because it's not just all new material to you. And part of the reason why I do this also is because I don't really have time in these sermons to read, these really long 4 chapters of poetry to you. So it would be really beneficial for you to read Job 9 through 11 this coming week. One of the things that you should be looking for when you're reading through these chapters in Job is questions. Because it's difficult material to read, right? It's not as easy as reading the prose, right? The storytelling of the first 2 chapters, and then you can easily see, okay, there's Job. He didn't curse God. He's doing what's right. Seems like I should just be like Job. That's pretty easy. It's not always that easy. So one of the things we should do when we're reading scripture is ask ourselves questions about the text and then see if we can answer them. That's what I'm going to be doing today. I'm going to be asking 2 questions about this text to kind of show you what I'm doing as I'm going through this text so that hopefully you can emulate it as well. Before we get to the questions, to set up the questions, I want to propose that there are, just like last week, there are 2 people who we're focused on, right? We've got Job, who says his speech in chapter 3, and then we've got his friend, Eliphaz, who's doing the speeches in chapter 4 and chapter 5. How do they respond to suffering, and is it an appropriate response to suffering? I'm going to suggest that both of them have some elements of truth and some elements of falsity. That's what we're going to address. To help demonstrate this, I'm going to give you an analogy, because I think this will be more helpful in framing the rest of our discussion. I want you to imagine that you're back in high school. I know some of you might have to think a little bit. And in high school, your calculus teacher is teaching you a concept and giving you a formula for for how you approach a certain problem. 2 weeks later, she's giving you homework and you see the problem and you're like, okay, I remember this, I'll apply this formula. So you apply the formula, you double check your work, make sure it's the right one, you turn it in, and the teacher gives it back to you and you got the problem wrong. What? I thought I applied the formula. You told me that this was the formula, I applied the formula and I got it wrong. Your friend is next to you, he looks over and he says, oh, you got it wrong. You must have messed up applying the formula. You must have not actually followed all the steps. You know, in calculus, you have to, there are 20 places where you could go wrong. He says, well, probably you messed up in one of those 20 places. So you must have just misapplied the formula. And you say, no, I checked it. I know I applied the formula right. Something must have been wrong with the teacher. That's what's going on in the book of Job, is you've got 2 people, Job and his friends, and both of them are wrong, but for different reasons. One, Job, thinks you always apply the same formula every time. And then his friends think, oh, he must have misapplied the formula. The formula is right, but he must have messed up somewhere. Both of them are wrong, and we'll see that through the rest of this, our time in Job together. Okay, so the first question that I hope you were asking when you were reading Job's speech was, is Job someone I should emulate? Is this kind of expression of suffering an appropriate response to suffering? Because as with everything, we don't want to just read it and then say, okay, great, that's what he said. We want to say, is this something that God approves of? Is this something I should emulate in my own life? So that's what you should have been asking when you're reading this chapter 3, where Job is opening his mouth and beginning to speak. So to set up a very brief context, right? You've got the friends who came over to see his suffering. They sat with him for 7 days and 7 nights saying nothing because they saw that his suffering was intense. First person to speak, Job. Job opens his mouth and he, according to verse 1, curses the day he was born. There are 2 things that he does in the rest of this passage. First of all, and quite simply, he just mourns. He weeps. He's upset and he's angry. The anger is not, at this point, directed to God. The anger is just directed, technically, at the day he was born. He says, why was I ever born? Just to suffer. There's a meme that is, why are we here just to suffer? That's what Job is experiencing here. Why am I on this earth just so that I can experience suffering? Why was I born if I'm just going to have to go through with this? So the first thing that he's doing is he's mourning. And I'm sure many of us can relate to this amount of grief. The second thing is he doesn't understand why God has not let him die. In chapter 2, when Satan said he wanted to test Job further, God said, you can test him up to this point, but don't take his life. So he placed a hedge of protection around Job. Notice what Job says in verse 23 of chapter 3, verse 23. He says, why is life given to a man whose path is hidden, whom God has hedged in? So this hedge that we thought might be protection, he thinks is a curse. I'm here just to suffer. I would like to be dead. Now, I was talking to my mom over FaceTime the other day, and she said, well, honestly, God was pretty generous in allowing him to still live. And I thought about that for a second, and as I was thinking about it more, I was thinking, I'm not sure that he thought it was a blessing, right? If you put yourself in Job's shoes, I know that's kind of difficult because it has probably not happened to anyone here, but if you have got all your 10 kids and you lose all of them in the same day, your wife tells you to curse God, you lose all of your possessions, you're sitting in an ash heap, scraping your oozing skin with broken pottery. Most of us probably wouldn't want to go on living. That seems like punishment to Job. So Job says, why am I still here? Why am I still suffering? Okay, so then we have to ask ourselves the question, is how Job responds praiseworthy or blameworthy? We'll start with how it's praiseworthy because there's actually a mixed opinion among commentators. I read various commentaries on different spectrums of where they felt Job's response landed. So I'll just tell you the good and the bad. The first good thing is that he doesn't ever curse God. If you notice, in Job 1 and 2, it specifically says Job did not sin or blame God for anything. Job did not sin in what he said. He did not curse God with his lips. In chapter 3, he still refrains from cursing God. He's angry, but he never curses God. I think that that's certainly a praiseworthy action, especially given the immense amount of suffering he was going through, right? The fact that he's going through so much pain and he's lashing out, but not at God. He's just angry that he's alive. Number two, though, I think that there are some blameworthy things that are happening here in chapter 3. And I say this with trepidation because I'm not saying blameworthy in the sense that I can't understand why he would do that, but still things that we should not want to emulate. And the most important thing is that he has the wrong view of God. He has the wrong view of God. Notice that he's asking this question, why, a lot. When we're asking why, we're looking for the reason. I don't understand what the reason for this is. If Job trusted that God was a just God, he wouldn't need to know the reason. He would understand that the reason is that God is always good, and whatever he's doing, God is doing for a just reason. But Job is asking that question, why? Now again, I don't say this because I don't understand it. It's certainly an understandable response, but he is not trusting God's justice. The second thing that indicates that perhaps Job's response is not the ideal response is found in verse 25. In verse 25, he says, "For the thing I feared has overtaken me, and what I dreaded has happened to me." Can I ask, how many of you have dreaded that you're going to lose all of your kids in one day, all of your possessions in one day, and that you're going to get afflicted with boils from head to toe? Probably not many of us have been thinking this, at least semi-regularly, that we're scared that this is going to happen. We know Job was thinking about this because in chapter 1, remember that he sacrifices on behalf of his children? He says, perhaps they have sinned and cursed God in their hearts. So he sacrifices all the time. He's trying to stave off God's wrath. He says, I'm doing everything I can to keep God happy. I just need to make sure God's not unhappy with my children, so I'm going to keep sacrificing to him so that he doesn't get mad at my children either. So there's a little bit twisted, and it's very subtle, right? It's not super obvious, but there's a little bit of a twisted view that Job believes that if he just does all the right things, God won't attack him. So the ultimate thing that we can take away from the way that Job responds is that he considers God unjust. He says, I've done all these things. I sacrificed even on behalf of my children. Why did this happen to me? I don't understand. Again, it's a very understandable response. It's a very human response. But that is a way in which he sees God wrongly. The next question we should be asking ourselves, moving into chapters 4 and 5, is his friend, Eliphaz. Eliphaz is the oldest of his friends, and we know this because according to both the book of Job and the ancient Near East literature, you always spoke oldest to youngest out of respect for the older people in your generation. So Eliphaz is the oldest person, and he speaks next. And if you read chapters 4 and 5, his thesis is summed up in verse 7. He says, "Who has perished when he was innocent? Where have the honest ever been destroyed? In my experience, those who plow injustice and sow trouble reap the same." So he tells Job in so many words, if you're suffering, man, it must be because you did something wrong. If evil's happening to you, it must have been because you were in some sense evil. That's Eliphaz's contention to Job. So in what ways is the way that Eliphaz responded good, and in what ways is it bad? Again, we'll start with what's good. First of all, I appreciate that he waited to speak. He was not the first person to speak. He let Job speak first. This week, Henry Silvas invited me to visit Christina in the hospital and pray over her and her dad, Toby. For those of you who don't know, Christina does have stage 4 cancer, and she's 41 years old. When I went into the room to pray for them, and Toby greeted us, he explained, here's how she's doing, and he was crying. Could you imagine if when I came into the room, I was like, Toby, in my experience, those who plow injustice and those who sow trouble reap the same. You do not start by talking, right? You don't start when people are experiencing suffering by talking first. You can be there for them. You can weep with them. You can sit in silence with them. You can tear your robes with them. But don't be the first person to speak. The second thing that's good about the way Eliphaz responds is that he has the general right idea. Usually, it is true that, as he says in verse 8, those who plow injustice and those who sow trouble will reap injustice and will reap trouble, right? Even in the New Testament, right? Galatians 6:7, you reap what you sow. This is a biblical principle. In 1 Peter 3:10-12, for he who wants to love life and see a long life, let him keep his tongue from evil. So if you don't say evil things, you'll have a long life. James 5:16, the prayer of a righteous man availeth much good, right? So if you're a righteous person, your prayers are going to do a lot more than an unrighteous person. Or last one, Ephesians 6:1, the most famous one. Honor your father and mother, so that it may go well with you, that you may live long in the land that the Lord your God has given to you. All of these things are, to some extent, true. So is Eliphaz lying that those who sow injustice will often reap injustice? No, that's a generally true principle. But here's where he goes wrong. Because these are general principles. They're not universal principles. It's not always true that everyone who's something bad happens to them, it's because they did something bad. So when I gave you that example with the math teacher and the formula, it may be true that you often apply a certain formula to answer a certain problem. But is it always true that in every single time when you get a problem, you should